this is Margaret from the blog Don't Call It Bollywood, and this is this week's box office post. This week's box office isn't that exciting just because it's mostly as expected. Padmavat did spectacularly well last week. It's continuing to do well, but not quite as well this week. Generally speaking, when a movie opens really, really big in the first week, the second week sees about a 50% drop in box office. There's several different reasons for this. Obviously, there was a big drive. A lot of people wanted to see it opening night. Now they've seen it, so they aren't going to be coming back the second week. Second, occasionally the ticket prices will be increased for the first week, which means the first week tickets will sell for more money and will make more money than in following weeks. There's also piracy. That's always a factor. That's part of the reason for these wide releases, so that everything gets out there before the pirates get it. And now that they have it, people might be staying home to watch on their computer instead of coming to the theater. What I find unusual this week, not the drop, is the screen count. So first, let me explain the drop. It made about 10,000 in America per screen last week. It's made about 5,000 in America per screen this week. The UK, it made about 5,000 last week. It's making about 3,500 this week. In Canada, it made 22,000 last week, making about 10,000 this week, and so on and so forth. 50% drop, totally normal. Except for Australia and New Zealand, where it dropped way more than 50%. In Australia, it was 24,000 last week per screen, and this week it's dropped all the way down to 6,000 per screen. New Zealand, 15,000 per screen, down to 5,000 per screen. What happened? This is a very unusual pattern. I mean, honestly, I'm guessing that I'm missing something really obvious, like there's some big sports event or some weather pattern or something that's going on in that part of the world, because otherwise this just makes no sense at all. One small thing that helps to explain part of this drop is the screen counts, and that's actually where I find things most interesting. Padmavat gained 18 screens in America to go from 326 last week to 344 this week. 18 screens isn't that unusual. That's essentially just 18 theaters who decided to give it one extra screen. And out of the over 300, that's not that big of a deal. Something similar happened in the UK. It went from, no, not in the UK. In Australia, it went from 70 to 75. In Canada, it went from 28 to 36, I believe. So there's these small increases in a couple of places, which is a little bit unusual in the second week to have these big increases, but I doubt it's because of a distributor or a massive influence, because it's so few. It really feels like individual theaters making that decision on their own. In the UK, meanwhile, it had a slight drop. And notice the UK had the lowest drop per screen of any of these places. It went from 5,000 last week, which is not great, and that's probably why some theaters dropped it, and it ended up holding kind of steady at 3,400. Instead of going down to half, it went down to about 2/3 per screen of what it was making last week. What I find very unusual is that the number of screens held steady week 1 to week 2. That almost never happens with a major release. Tiger Zindahe, for instance, lost about 50 screens in its second week. And it did very well the first week. It wasn't like people were fleeing from it. It's just this is the standard pattern. The first week has the maximum number of screens, and then the second week the screens start to drop off. It's how you can maximize sort of the health of the industry as a whole. That first weekend, yes, you know you're going to get the majority of your audience and the most people, so you want as many screens as possible. But in the second week, you want to keep the per screen amount as healthy as possible so that each individual theater is making the largest amount of profit, and you want to make space for other films that might be coming out, so you drop a little bit. But not Padmavat. Padmavat, everywhere in the world except for the UK, either held steady or went up a few screens. The up a few screens, like I said, I'm going to ignore that because that's just a few theater owners making their own decisions. The holding steady is what strikes me. This is very strange. It makes me wonder if perhaps the distributors insisted on theaters giving them a 2-week deal, because it's very odd to have almost the exact same number of screens week 1 to week 2. Even going up more would make more sense to me. That's what happened with Nirja. It almost doubled in the number of screens in week 2 after it became a sleeper hit in week 1. That's the distributors realizing they had a hit on their hands and theaters rushing to get it. That makes sense. But if you know it's a hit in week 1, wouldn't you plan for a drop-off in week 2 because everyone who wants to see it will have seen it in week 1? But they didn't. And this brings me back to what Padmavat has felt like to me all along, and that's a somewhat selfish film. Not the content of the film exactly, but the way it was released and distributed. The focus on getting the release date they wanted, no matter what anyone else wanted. The focus on releasing with controversial content and not handling the controversy in a way that would be the best for the film industry as a whole, but rather would just serve to create publicity for their individual film. And now we have what looks to me like a distribution practice that forced theaters to hold it over even if they didn't want to for a second week, and which has led the per screen count to take a dive. This isn't to take anything away from the success of Padmavat. It was still enormously, record-breakingly successful last week. It's still doing very, very well this week. It just feels like perhaps some theaters are being forced to still play it even though they don't really want to. Anyway, that's what it looks like to me. You can agree, you can disagree. There's a related post linked right below. Leave me a comment there. I'd love to talk with you. Thanks!